Welcome to this webinar on the Financial Abuse Awareness Series. My name is Bill Mitchell. The series is part of the Financial Protections Project, co-designed by Queensland Government, Caxton Legal Centre and Townsville Community Law. This series is an online continuing professional development program that aims to raise financial industry awareness about the financial abuse of older persons. Before we begin, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This presentation is the first in the skills modules and it's about working with older persons. The slides are not read verbatim but paraphrased for emphasis. They are designed to be standalone, readable modules and contain references for deeper learning. So let's begin. Before we begin, let's take a moment to think about this statement from the Australian Parliament's Older People in the Law report. It says it's easy to stereotype older Australians as frail, easily duped and in need of protection and assistance in managing their affairs. While some older Australians do indeed need assistance, many are living vital, fulfilling lives, are active within their local communities and making significant contributions. How do our ideas about older persons, our social constructs and stereotypes colour the way we work with them as clients? Working effectively with older persons, especially those at risk of or experiencing financial abuse, requires specialist knowledge and some key skills. Developing an appropriate approach to working with older persons is ethically sound practice. It involves effective interviewing techniques and environments, taking an older person-centred approach, ensuring privacy, confidentiality and safety, but it's also fundamental to have conversations with older persons that are sensitive to their conceptions and the particular nuances of abuse. You can see the learning outcomes of this module on the right-hand side. This module includes working with older persons in the law, talking about abuse, dealing with positions of trust, not talking about abuse, and also interviewing older persons. Older persons in the law, it's important to understand that older persons are less likely to take legal action or even action through general information and education initiatives, and will benefit from tailored initiatives that actually reach into the community. They have a lower reporting of legal issues. It's probably to do with three things. They don't identify legal needs, they're reluctant to complain, and they in fact have a tendency to ignore legal needs. Advisors must understand that if they act in a position of trust with older persons, that relationship creates a range of possible duties that need to be observed, including statutory duties, contractual duties, duties in tort, duties in equity, and ethical duties. Here's an industry example where the CPA notes that the position of trust is a very important part of the relationship between accountant and client. It says accountants, particularly those in public practice, are typically persons who clients trust to know and understand financial matters which can affect them. This position of trust implies trusted advisors can be perpetrators within the definition of elder abuse. Advisors must know their client. This goes a long way to avoiding becoming complicit in financial abuse. It's also essential when an advisor is planning or taking proactive steps to avoid possible abuse at a later date. It's important for advisors to know two separate issues. Firstly, who is the client, and thereby avoiding undue influence? And secondly, what is the interests of the client? For accountants, this includes all of the fundamental principles and specific issues, such as communicating with those charged with governance only. For licensed financial advisors, additional statutory duties include knowing their client's suitability for credit and their best interest obligations when giving financial advice. When interviewing older persons, advisors must have adapted interviewing processes. Making older persons feel comfortable is a first step in making them share personal information. The environment must be conducive to effective communication, taking into account a range of sensory deficits. Considerations also include privacy, light, background noise, seating arrangements and language. Conversations need to be warm, empathetic and non-judgmental. Your ability to engage older persons is central to the success of your client relationship. Older persons may be more comfortable in their home, but this isn't always possible, nor is it always appropriate. It could be the setting of abuse and the perpetrator may be present. This can also occur when third parties accompany older persons to advisors' offices. Direct questioning about abuse needs to be sensitive and acceptable to ensure accurate disclosure. Self-reporting can lead to incomplete responses and can be problematic. Self-reporting can't always be relied upon to identify and treat cases of elder abuse either, because research shows that older persons may actively hide symptoms during interviewing. The CPA Australia gives an industry example about how older persons may not be forthcoming about abuse for a range of reasons, and the reasons are listed there on the left-hand side in the bullet points. So take a moment to read them. A central skill in working with older persons is taking a person-centered approach. In this case, an older person-centered approach. This means that we need to deal with some underlying assumptions. People are more than the sum of their cognitive abilities. We shouldn't overemphasize deficits and underemphasize strengths. And it's particularly important to understand the person's subjective experience, particularly in relation to their positive and negative reactions to others' behaviour. At the core of person-centered care or person-centered approach is the self, who we are, our conscience, our views, our values and beliefs. Selfhood is much more than memory, and recognising and maintaining selfhood is key to a person-centered approach. Selfhood is autonomy. People are individuals with unique experiences, needs and preferences. They must be seen in the context of their daily lives and as part of the family and community. Here's an industry approach about taking an older person-centered approach. A recent report by NARI talked about elder abuse interventions from an older person's perspective. Take a moment to read the quote. And after you've read it, ask yourself, can you encourage this in your own work environment or more broadly within your community? An older person-centered approach is also a consistent message in the Royal Commission into Misconduct into Banking, Superannuation and Financial Services. Where older persons are entering financial arrangements with third parties, timely, independent advice is key. This might include you providing advice yourself or facilitating the provision of advice or a combination of both. Industry examples, including the Financial Counselling Association of Queensland Code of Ethics, sets out that financial counsellors operate from a client-centred approach through empowerment and advocacy. Privacy and confidentiality are obligations owed by all advisors to clients and sometimes third parties. They can be statutory, contractual, legal or ethical. Observing these things is essential to an older person-centred approach. Care should always be taken to interview an older person alone. If you are working with clients remotely, for example through email, care should be taken to identify who has access to the older person's mobile phone, computer or other electronic records such as email. There are some industry examples about the duty of confidentiality, and the accountant's duty of confidentiality is set out there in APES 110. It's very easy to have an inadvertent disclosure or a breach of confidentiality to a close or immediate family member. You should also be aware that a breach of duty of confidentiality can give rise to legal, disciplinary and regulatory considerations. It's important to be talking about abuse. The state government's campaign, There's No Excuse for Abuse, has been successful so far. It's an important awareness campaign that tries to begin a community conversation about elder abuse. You can find some resources at the government's website, which is listed today on that page. But when dealing with older persons, messages do need to be nuanced and subtle, and we need to make sure that older persons feel comfortable. They may not be comfortable or could be frightened to discuss financial abuse, or they may not even realise they're experiencing it at all. Sometimes it might be best to not talk about abuse if it's too confronting. Alternative conversations can be had. The sensitivity of the topic is important. There is a lack of discourse in everyday society, and research shows that older people consistently hide their concerns about it, and it's a consistently hidden nature within the community. Older persons' conceptions of abuse provide important insights into how we can have a conversation by using how they see and define elder abuse. Very little work has been done on older persons' personal views of financial abuse, but it's very important research that helps us identify how to have conversations. Here's some individual and community attitudes towards elder abuse. And you can see there are some similarities across groups, but also some differences. Take the time to have a look at this later on. Importantly, older persons' own conceptions of abuse show that three dominant issues, including changing society, changing families, and individual determinants, are highlighted by older persons as reasons or causes of abuse. A recent review of how older persons conceive abuse is very enlightening. Two common themes were issues of family loyalty and family obligations, and many older persons perceived abuse as a failure by families to value and respect older persons. The systemic review also revealed that not all older persons understand the concept of elder abuse. Older persons conceptualise elder abuse on a societal level as well as an individual level. Older persons do recognise the impact of ageism and disempowerment, and they do understand and value the central role of our family carers. Older persons attributed abuse to dependency and vulnerability, changing norms and values, the changed position of older persons in today's society, which is marginalised and disadvantaged, a lack of respect for older persons, and a general lack of social control and responsibility in modern society. Here CPA Australia gives an industry example of older persons' conceptions. They say, an unwillingness to accept that they are a victim of financial abuse is a common reaction for older persons. Denial is a common first reaction. Disbelief that they are victims of abuse can often be followed by anger. The CPA provides a very useful piece of guidance here. Research also shows that older people have some very consistent conceptions of elder abuse. They include that under the category of caregiving, changing structures within families and changing expectations have led to abusive situations. There's a changing perception of the caregiver role which impacts on older persons. Additionally, the loss of a spouse or remarriage can also contribute to complex family dynamics and even conflict. Important interactions noted by older persons included the use of coercive force, and that abuse can be retaliation for previous conflict, and that habitual abuse was deemed to be more serious than a single event or a one-off. Older persons also recognise the intergenerational nature of violence. Adults who perpetrated abuse on their children become victims of abuse when they are older and dependent. Older persons' views about what is abusive can be quite different. Their focus in research is on physical violence and intentionality. Despite references to robbery, financial abuse is infrequently identified as a form of elder abuse, particularly within the home or family setting. Older persons who did identify financial abuse thought it was common, but the majority of older persons did not recognise financial abuse as a type of elder abuse. In rating the severity of different types of abuse, older persons noted that those lacking physical and mental capacity were deemed to be more vulnerable, and so the actions of the carer were thought to be more abusive. Older persons also thought having greater physical size or strength could make a carer more powerful. Financial abuse was frequently rated as the least serious form of abuse. Older persons sometimes think they bring elder abuse on themselves. They open their door to strangers, lend money to their children, don't speak up for themselves or carry too much cash. Focusing on the behaviours of the perpetrators of abuse can help have a conversation that shifts an older person away from the blame game. Older persons' view of society in general is less caring and ageist, and it has the potential to alienate older people. Older persons refer to a loss of respect in society that they believe is filtered down to a personal level and impacts on them. This lack of respect in health and care facilities and feelings of being worthless once becoming a pensioner were mentioned by older persons in research. Older persons are ashamed of talking about financial abuse, and it often exists within their close social networks. Their perpetrators are family or friends. Some cultural and religious contexts may also heighten a sense of shame. The interfamilial and intergenerational nature of abuse can also deepen an older person's sense of shame. It's important to note that older people perceive abuse differently than it's described and defined. This means that conversations, discussions, and messages must bridge that gap between how older people see abuse and how it's defined. Older persons who don't seek assistance may simply fail to see that they are victims. Even older persons' supporters have difficulty recognising the nature of financial abuse. Some supporters perceived that financial abuse was related to scams, as opposed to family members taking advantage of an older person. There are some cultural aspects that are important to know. There is great variability between cultures. The four aspects have been identified. How much directness is valued in the conversation with the older person? Should you get right to the point, or should you be more indirect? How hierarchical a society is. For example, do people tend to know their place and follow the rules, or is there freedom to disagree? How much value is placed on groups reaching unanimous consensus versus allowing individuals to dissent and reach different conclusions? And whether more emphasis is placed on the rights of individuals versus the importance and centrality of the group. Key considerations when working with older persons from diverse cultural backgrounds include acting with compassion and sincerity, recognising that older persons hold on to native cultural values, and learning about unique cultures. Respect is key. Language is fundamental, and an objective interpreter should be obtained if the professional cannot speak the person's language. Avoiding bringing shame on one's family is also a widely shared cultural value, especially so in societies where there's more of an emphasis on family and family honour. These are key considerations when working with older persons from diverse cultural backgrounds. It's important to note that things might be different in regional and rural areas, including in farming communities, a lack of resources, a lack of services, and different arrangements and different dynamics in family asset holdings, and also in reporting or disclosing elder abuse may come into play. Cultural factors can also play a role in communities where there are predominant cold populations, or populations of people from particular cultural and linguistic diverse backgrounds. It's important to test the presence of social isolation and talk to the person about whether they've had or are socially isolated or had isolating life events, such as losing a partner or losing employment. It's important to use positive messages when you're talking to older people about these issues and emphasising autonomy and independence and making own decisions. Before we leave this module, let's think about working effectively with older persons and the skills you need to do that. Think about, is your usual setting conducive to working with older persons? Are you in a position of trust, and what are the implications of that? Do you adapt your style when interviewing older persons? Do you take an older person-centred approach? How do you broach the subject of financial abuse if needed? And what is your own attitude to abuse, and does it colour your interactions? And are you listening for cues that mask abuse by older persons' conceptions? Thanks for listening to this webinar series. Feel free to download the PDF file for future reference. The next module is Module 2 of the Skills modules, and it's about working with capacity issues. Thanks for joining us.